This story is about a beautiful man named Henry, who unfortunately had to experience something terrible, namely betrayal at the hands of his own student, whom he raised with great love and care. At the moment, the man is facing the Supreme Court for crimes he didn't commit, and as sad as it sounds, this day will be his last. Mary's former apprentice has done her best to take the royal throne and turn the people against her teacher. And she has succeeded. At the moment, there are a lot of dignitaries in this room, as well as ordinary people. The girl has brainwashed them so much that absolutely every one of them is waiting only one thing: to see how Mary will take Henry's life. At that moment, the man remembered and spoke aloud how he had given the blade to his apprentice. He had never thought that one day the gift would be directed at him. His mind also began to recall moments from the day Henry had taken the girl in for foster care. Frankly speaking, he replaced her father in the moment, as he became not only a good teacher, but also a support in life, a protector, and just a man on whom you can always rely. But when Mary grew up, she changed her views on life and completely forgot what the man did for her. In the end, without regret, the girl gripped her sword tightly and delivered a decisive blow to Henry's heart, in front of everyone in the room. To be honest, the reaction was mixed, some worried, some overjoyed. But there is a logical explanation for this. Mary has structured her policy so that those people who do not support her, and openly express their position, are in great danger, and with a probability of 90%, will be caught somewhere on the street, and then quietly destroyed. After the man stopped breathing, he realized that it was time to use his rainy day manuscript rebirth. This thing allows you to move to another reality, and continue to live there, but the only downside is that it is unknown what time it will be. This time a man was lucky enough to take over the body of the prince villain of the novella. In his past life, Henry had done a great job and used everything he could to avoid the final forfeiture of his character's life. He also cultivated Mary as carefully as possible so that in the future she could stabilize the situation in the new dynasty and become empress. Henry was almost sure that the fatal fate was avoided, but in the end they got rid of him anyway. But now everything will be different. After a detailed analysis of all the mistakes made in his past life, the man will definitely not repeat them again, and will do everything as it should be done. Suddenly, the driver enters his carriage and tells him that they'll be leaving in 5 minutes. Henry first asked him to remind him where they were going and how long the journey would take. The answer pleasantly surprised the man, for now they were going straight to the orphanage, the place where he had first met Mary, and had taken her from there to foster her. After realizing what lay ahead, Henry asked the driver to drive as fast as possible, and if possible not to stop at all, to which he kindly agreed. For now, Mary is a young and weak orphan. The man even managed to decide for himself firmly that in this life certainly does not intend to bring her up. When Henry arrived at the orphanage, he saw a whole bunch of poor little children, living in some slums, and dressed in rags, to put it mildly, and sometimes there were cases when a child was so poorly dressed that it was hard to call the thing he was wearing clothes. Meanwhile, little Mary was looking very intently at what was going on around her, and looking at her case. As it turned out, the girl had changed here too, and remembered her past life with perfect accuracy. Let's find out why this happened. Only a few days had passed since Mary had defiantly taken Henry's life. She was sitting in her throne feeling fine and there was no sign of trouble, when suddenly 2 servants came to her and reported that coalition forces were trying to surround the palace, and for her own safety it was best to leave the building. For some reason Mary was very skeptical of these words and didn't pay much attention to them, and she said she was never going to leave because she was waiting for someone at the moment. Immediately after these words, someone kicks in the front door with great force. She was a girl named Alexandra, a very powerful witch in her own right, with unique powers. As soon as the servants saw her, they shouted for Mary to get out of here quickly, and they in turn would try to detain her. Alexandra was surprised to hear how loyal her direct rival's servants were. But be that as it may, with just one slight movement of her hand, the girl got rid of them in a blink of an eye. Now no one was blocking her path to her main goal anymore. To be honest, it wasn't exactly the person Mary had expected to see, but Alexandra came nonetheless, and judging by the wry smile on her face, one can assume she'd been preparing for this long-awaited meeting for a very long time. Before doing what she came to do, the girl decided to pay tribute to her rival, for since Henry had taken her from the orphanage, she had been able to organize fame and fortune for herself, and had even managed to ascend to the throne. But when a man achieves things by such drastic means, he doesn't live long. So far, Mary does not even realize that she is about to lose her life, so she continues to behave rather pathologically, and does not feel any boundaries at all. But a little later, Alexandra does hint to her that she's aware of the recent incident. Of course, getting near the mayor's office used to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, because Henry protected her better than he did, but now all that's changed. Because of her own stupidity, the girl became an easy target, and she paid the price when she got the same sword as her teacher. Intoxicated with power, Mary without the slightest hesitation took the life of her teacher. This act very much disliked Alexandra, and in her opinion, such a stupid girl is clearly not worthy to be called empress. When the girl has fully realized that this is the end, she realized that she herself was to blame for everything. If only she could turn back time, she would never do such a stupid thing again. But she did, and at least her life wasn't completely over. Now she has a unique opportunity to live it differently, but she'll have to start all over again. In the meantime, another girl from the orphanage came to the dumbfounded Mary, and told her to change into a more beautiful outfit as soon as possible, because a noble lord was about to arrive to choose one of the children and take them for his education. After these words, Mary was 100% convinced that events were unfolding exactly as they had in her previous life. In this case, she was even very happy, because she thought that the young master would choose her and give her a chance to get white wealth and reputation again. Then a senior came into their room, and informed them that after the children had changed, they should gather in the front yard. It is also important to make happy smiling faces, so that the customer looking at the children fully felt that he was really welcome here. This little girl with white hair, that's Alexandra, and for some reason she didn't dress up in a pretty outfit like all the other children, and there was no joy on her face at all. When the eldest needed her, he went straight to her and ordered her to the backyard. To save the situation, Alexandra tearfully asked to be allowed to sit in the corner, and she promised not to embarrass the noble lord with her ugly outfit. In the end, it worked, and the mouse sat down in a separate corner, as promised, and made no sound, at least not yet. Meanwhile, Henry was about to meet them, his mind only thinking that their fates would not intertwine with Mary's this time around. Even though the man was already fully aware that his life had started over, as soon as he saw Mary, he still felt a little shock inside him. Before letting the noble lord choose the child, the elders make a small presentation to him. According to the results of the endurance test of all children, a girl named Mary is far superior to all other ordinary people. To make a long story short, she is perfect as a slave and as a future warrior. Another peculiarity of this girl is that her bones are simply devouring with their quality. In general, all the elders unanimously recommended to take Mary, but also did not forget to add that on this copy with such high indicators, the price will be a little higher than the others. Henry turned around sharply, and said he didn't care about the price, he just wanted to pick a decent one. After looking around, he noticed the cornered Alexandra, which was the first time Henry assumed it was her. To be sure of his guesses, the man pointed his finger at her and asked to bring her closer. To put it mildly, the elders were shocked, because the gentleman pointed to the worst of all options, with very weak bones. Instead of calling the little girl closer, they instead started asking her to leave. Despite such loud declarations from his elders, Henry continued to scrutinize Alexandra, and at one point became convinced that it was really her. Now the big question is how the story will turn out if the man chooses her this time. When the little girl realized that the gentleman has already been looking at her for quite a long time, decided not to sit idle, and take the situation into their own hands and begins to act. All in tears, she jumps at the feet of the gentleman, and begins to beg him to take her, arguing that it will serve faithfully and truthfully. Of course, for such terrible behavior, and disrespectful attitude to the Lord, the elders immediately began to punish her. One of the men grabbed the girl by the hair and began to drag her somewhere. In that short period of time, Henry had time to think and make a decision, so he asked the man to stop. In that case, the elder let her go, and Alexandra fell to the ground. Then she immediately got up and crawled to the gentleman to beg him to take her away. As Henry was already comfortable with this, before agreeing to the purchase, he began to ask if the girl would be faithful to him all her life. She answered not only yes to all the questions she was asked, but also added that if the young master would take her, she would do any errands without fail. That's basically what Henry wanted to hear from his future apprentice. At the same time Mary was watching this story closely. She could not believe what was happening before her eyes, because she was almost 100% sure that she would be chosen. She had only one question in her mind: what was going on at all? To be honest, the elders themselves could not understand how such a thing could happen at all, but nevertheless one sale has already been made, and that's good. When the men saw that the gentleman had taken only one girl and started to walk, they decided not to lose the opportunity, and to try to sell another one, arguing that there were many more capable children than Alexandra, and they just kept referring to Mary. To put it mildly, this was starting to get annoying, so Henry decided to respond harshly, making it clear that no one dared tell him what to do. After these words, the guys were not scared out of their wits, so they immediately decided to turn off their sales pitch and apologize for their excessive insistence. Then already Mary gets out of her seat and starts running towards the gentleman to also try to persuade him to take her with him. In the end, she, like Alexandra, caught hold of the gentleman's clothes and started shouting in a loud voice that she should be taken away too. Of course, the older ones reacted quickly and immediately ran to take her off, because such actions are a sign of disrespect to the customer, for which children are usually punished very much. When the situation had calmed down a little, Henry took Mary's hand gently, gave her hope of thinking that he would take her away, and then threw her aside with such force that she fell to the floor. It was a small revenge for the very years when the man had kept her under his wing, and had shared the last crumb. After this situation, he once again announced to everyone that only Alexandra would go with him, and he didn't need any more children. Before letting Henry out of the territory, the elder remembered one small detail, namely, if a man wanted to take only one child, the price would be twice as high for him. When the gentleman heard you, he turned to the older man with a smile on his face, for after the announced price, it was immediately clear that the seller had decided to deliberately inflate the price, and thus a little blackmail. In that case, Henry wondered what would happen if he refused to pay at all. At this question the elder decided not to answer, and immediately began to act. On the order of 2 armed men from the back attacked Henry. Surely they hoped for a fairly quick and easy victory. But this kind of rivals compared to the Lord can't even be called rivals. With just one hand, Henry managed to get rid of 2 trained armed guys. To be honest, initially they didn't even realize that their lives were over. Unfortunately, this is not the end of the battle, but only the beginning. After these 2 immediately appeared 4 more opponents. As Henry did not come alone, but with his assistant, he asked him to make quick work of all these so-called obstacles. Of course, the man did not refuse, and in just a few minutes he had completed his task perfectly. When all the mercenaries were already unconscious, one of the surviving elders, in order to divert his rival's attention, began to beg for mercy, saying that he would give Henry all the spiritual stones and treasures he had. But in fact, in his head, he had devised a cunning plan, the point of which was to try to take the girl hostage and make threats against her. But as soon as the eldest tried to implement it, he almost instantly paid for his lie, and probably already regretted 10 times that he tried to implement the plan. Even after delivering such a serious blow, Henry had a casual expression on his face as if nothing had happened. When his opponent's state of painful shock had passed, and he began to feel the full extent of his wounds, Henry said that no one had the right to infringe on this little girl's life. Then the Lord gave the first order for his new pupil. Its essence was that the little girl should take a sword in her hands and without much thought, use it to take the life of the elder, who had probably quite often offended the girl in every possible way, and so on. At the same moment, the girl began to remember all the sad and hurtful moments directly related to this senior. It was a completely ordinary day. The children were brought to the lunch break, and instead of letting Alexandra eat in peace, she was shouted at constantly. In the older girl's opinion, it was worth it to stop eating so much food. After all, if you consider her physical performance, it's a pointless waste of resources. Sometimes the older one could split to the point where he would just squeeze the girl on the floor, sit on top of her, and start to absorb right in front of everyone. But even despite all these moments, Alexandra, probably because of her age, did not feel any terrible anger, so it was still quite difficult for her to decide to destroy the older man. To light the fire inside the girl a little more, he told her that this man had entered into a howard with a very important person. Then he started collecting homeless children from all over the county, making them into so-called merchandise, and eventually selling them. Also, the gentleman added that Alexander has had a lifetime to live, and now she has a unique opportunity to take the life of this no-good man. As soon as Henry finished his speech, the girl's expression changed almost instantly to one of determination. Her eyes filled with anger at what had been done to her. Meanwhile, the older man was lying on the floor, talking about how the little girl wouldn't dare destroy him, because he was the one who had picked her up and nursed her. He was trying to push her in the opposite direction, but with all the suffering the little girl had been through, it was definitely not going to work. When a man is in extreme danger and his life is at stake, the only thing he can think about is saving himself. At the moment when the man came to a full realization of the situation, he promised Alexandra that he would continue to pursue her even after he lost his life, and asked her to finish as soon as possible, so that this torture would finally stop. This was probably the only request of the elder, to which the girl agreed with great pleasure, and fulfilled it almost instantly. Even when the man had already lost his life, Alexandra did not lose enthusiasm, and continued to carry a large number of sword strikes. This lasted until Henry stopped her, and in the process Alexandra seemed to go into a trance, and could no longer control herself. Then the little girl knelt before her master, and reported that the order had been obeyed. So Henry took her by the hand and told her that if she followed him faithfully, no one would ever hurt her again, and even if they did, they'd end up dead in minutes. By the way, since the other kids were without their elders, we had to figure out how to help them. Henry asked his assistant to give them a certain amount of money and let them go free. Let them try to survive. Taking them all back to their homes was not an option. Meanwhile, Mary was all over the place, yelling for the young master to wait for her. Of course, no one responded to her requests. The boys just walked on and got into the carriage to make their way. The first thing Henry did was to ask his new student if she would like something to eat. Of course, she was incredibly hungry, but because she was embarrassed, she said she wasn't very hungry. As a result, Henry realized it at once, so he offered the girl to start with a plate of tasty khinkali. The little girl's surprise was unprecedented, and when the process of eating came, she began to eat with great speed. Henry assured her that it is better to do it slowly, because at least no one will take away the food. 165. They then proceeded to discuss some formalities. As the man had already had the bitter experience, he offered the following conditions. If Alexandra really wanted to follow him, she must allow him to place a restriction on her body. Once they take effect, Alexandra will never be able to disobey her teacher's orders again, and she will never be able to attack him, because if she does, her soul will simply leave her body. Before doing so, Henry thought it prudent to give her a choice, and told her to think long and hard. After only a few seconds, Alexandra looked at him confidently, and said that she had made her choice a long time ago, and she had no intention of taking it back. In that case, Henry urged her to relax her body and not to resist. After a while everything was ready. To make sure everything was working, the master asked Alexandra to try to hit him. When the mouse tried, she felt a slight pain inside her. This is roughly how the effect of the restrictions would work. Now if in the future the little girl will do something to her master to harm, it is no longer a slight pain is not done, and will be able to fully feel the full power of this effect. Alexandra in turn said that in her whole life she will definitely never feel this pain once. In the meantime, the boys have finally arrived together. Henry has ordered his assistant to set aside a room for the girl, and have someone put her in complete order. The gentleman in turn wants to go away for a while, as he still has some unresolved issues to deal with. The assistant Jacob kindly agreed, and asked the little girl to follow him to show her new private room, which previously JYF could only dream of. As soon as the front door opened, Alexandra saw this luxurious room and simply could not believe her eyes. Frankly speaking, she was in a strong shock. In her opinion, she was not worthy to live in such a place, so on the background of strong stress began to run away and say that it is not necessary to allocate for her such chambers, and in the stables you can also sleep normally. The years of living in so-called slavery had not been in vain, and Alexandra was really, truly sure that she would never be better off anywhere else than in the stable. Jacob smiled in response and said that Henry had personally chosen this room for her. It's also time to remember that only horses live in the stable. In about 5 minutes, a servant should be here to help the girl change and wash, while Henry takes care of the meal. Alexandra slowly began to realize that the young gentleman was really too kind to her. Meanwhile, the gentleman has gone to town at a brisk pace to retrieve a rather valuable item. And if he was not mistaken, it should still be there. As it turned out, Henry came to a small shop where, just at the same time, a man wanted to buy the same item as the gentleman. The only problem was that this buyer did not have enough money, and he tried to bargain in every possible way to get the stone as favorably as possible. But the seller was not a pushover, and constantly refused all the offers that came from the man. When Henry finally walked up to the shop and said he would give 100 spirit stones for the pendant. Of course, the seller and his potential customers were shocked at the amount of money, because selling it for that amount of money was considered very profitable for the store. As soon as the salesman realized that he was not the poorest customer, he began to tell them that the pendant was a family relic, to try to drive up the price. But he couldn't do that, because Henry knew that the salesman was selling it for only 50 spirit stones. In such a case, the desire to continue padding the price immediately disappeared, and the man agreed to sell the item for 100 spiritual stones. One can only imagine how much this situation pissed off the man who had come to buy it first. By the way, this guy who wanted to buy the crystal, his name is Mason. Originally as a child he was an ordinary orphan that wandered the streets. But there was one thing about him: the boy had the gift of recognizing rare spiritual properties. It was this skill that allowed him to rise from his knees. They were also quite intimately acquainted with Henry, but they disliked each other, to put it mildly, and after each meeting in town, hoped it would be their last. But even in spite of this great reluctance to see each other, fate brought them together occasionally. Thanks to his skills, Mason sensed that the aura emanating from this pendant was unlike anything he'd ever felt before. It was by far the best he'd ever encountered in his life. The pendant was so close and yet so far away, the desire for revenge was slowly beginning to take over. Suddenly, somewhere in the distance, the man noticed a very bright glow. At first glance it looked like a strong stream of spiritual energy. Could it be that fate has prepared something else for Mason besides the jade pendant, which he had failed to buy at the shop? We must go there as soon as possible. Meanwhile, on the way home, Henry had already used the stone for its intended purpose, namely, he resolved the outer shell, took out the inner energy and began to weave it together. Now he had on his hands all the objects he could only dream of before. Thanks to the Cloud Scroll of Immortality and the Cloud Spiritual Key, Henry will be able to learn the way to the secret spiritual realm, and if he can get it, he will be able to comprehend the realm of heaven, which is a whole other level of power. The so-called spiritual realm is a secret art, created by one of the great masters of the past. Its peculiarity is that it contains priceless possibilities and knowledge, and legends say that here are hidden treasures of the ancient masters, which are worth insane amounts of money. Apparently this time Henry was extremely determined. He would not let anyone else control his fate but himself. When a gentleman returns home, he is immediately greeted by the servants, no matter how many times a day he does it, it is part of their direct duties. Jacob reported at the first opportunity that a third room had been assigned to Alexandra in the east wing of the manor, and he also reported that dinner was ready and could be served. Henry thanked him for the information and said he would check on the girl first. As the estate is quite large, it took the man some time to get to his new student, but still he managed. When the man entered the room, he saw that the little girl was already being washed and prepared for the cultural life on the estate. Even after some time, the little girl was still quite embarrassed, and asked to be left alone in this sauna, so that she could wash herself. In the end, the servants decided to listen to her, and left the girl alone in this luxurious bath. In the depths of her heart she really felt great joy, because at least for the first time in a long time she was able to wash herself so well, and relax in warm water. When Alexandra heard the young gentleman's voice, she immediately began to worry, because she was still in the bathtub and completely unclothed. For some reason, after the gentleman entered the room, the girl, instead of getting out of the bathtub and getting ready, quickly decided to dive under the water. Eventually Henry realized that Alexandra was currently unclothed, so he closed the door and apologized for his impudence. As soon as it happened, the little girl immediately got out of the bath, and in a quick pace began to dress, to come to him as soon as possible. As soon as possible, she asked him to forgive her for waiting so long, because it was not on purpose. At the same time, Henry was looking at her very closely, and told her that the outfit fit her perfectly, for the little girl had forgotten the last time she had heard compliments from anyone, and it was a great pleasure to hear such words, and moreover from the gentleman himself. Then he asked Alexander to follow him, because right now they are appearing to eat, and after the meal they will definitely need to taste something. Literally at every turn all the servants greeted their master. You can see with the naked eye how much they respect him. When Alexander saw how many on the table of exquisite dishes, she literally began to drool, because it was not that she had not eaten for a long time, she basically never tasted it, but only heard that it exists, and in itself very tasty, at least the flavors spoke for themselves. The servant immediately noticed this and urged her to eat more slowly, because if you do it too fast you can choke, but it was too late. The process was started. At the end of the meal, the girl at least tasted everything on the table, and was so full that she couldn't move for a while, but at least she was happy and full. Then she turned to the young gentleman and said she didn't usually eat this much, and you don't know what got into her. Regardless, Henry asked that the chef be told not to reduce the portion sizes any further, because he was certainly not going to skimp on the child's nutrition. Well, now that the meal was over, it was time to move on. When the boys had gone into the other room, Henry handed the girl the cloud scroll of immortality, and asked her to look at it carefully, and to study carefully the meanings it contained. As you can already guess, the gentleman was madly wondering what would happen if he allowed such a powerful girl to wield such incredible power. Meanwhile, the salesman who had sold Henry the pendant yesterday was furious. He was beginning to regret having ruled for only 100 spirit stones. He realized that he should have checked more carefully, because what if that trinket contained very rare properties? Then he was approached by a very interested customer, and first he looked through the whole assortment, and then he showed him a photograph and asked him a question. Anyway, he wanted the pendant that's on it. To put it mildly, the seller was shocked, because the client showed the very thing he had sold yesterday for nothing. Of course, he understands what he is talking about, but now he has to make an important decision whether to tell where the pendant is or not. In the meantime, Henry and Alexandra were already practicing, and the man was now trying to get the girl to breathe the spiritual powers of heaven and earth into her body. As he practiced, he was once again convinced that this child had extraordinary talents. At one point, Alexandra became violently ill and began coughing up blood. Apparently her body was not yet ready for such a sudden influx of energy. Henry realized that this could happen, so he was prepared for any outcome. First he put the girl in a comfortable position, and then he asked to call the doctor. Meanwhile, Mason had already reached the direct source, from where he saw a huge glow. Coming closer, the guy began to check where exactly this source was coming from, so as not to accidentally enter someone else's room. Using his skills, he was able to determine that there was a little girl behind the wall. It's hard to imagine that she's his second chance. When suddenly, while spying, Mason accidentally stepped on a branch, which broke and made a loud noise. At the same moment, the girl moves behind his back, takes a piece of twig in her hand, and puts it right to the throat of her victim. Luckily, she didn't think to take his life at once, but first decided to ask a few questions, like who he is and how he found her. Not thinking long, the boy immediately said that his name was Mason, and he had been a homeless orphan since he was a child for 15 years. This name seemed very familiar to Mary, because in his previous life the ministers had insisted that a member of a certain sect named Mason be brought into the court. Then they assured the girl that the boy had an unprecedented gift for finding treasure. But for some reason Henry refused to take him, because he didn't like him for some reason. Looking at this situation from the benefit side, this boy could really help Mary with finding rare artifacts, and in the end, this should greatly speed up the cultivation process. After realizing this, the girl threw the branch to the floor, let go of the boy, and stood aside with an offer to keep her company. Of course, he did not think long and agreed, because in principle, this friendly relationship between them, quite mutually beneficial, the guys, if they did everything right, will greatly speed up their personal cultivation processes. Meanwhile, Alexandra was lying in bed, despite the fact that this girl's body is endowed with a mysterious gift. Her condition is very deplorable, because of which her spiritual form has been greatly weakened. This also explains her bottomless appetite. Her body is trying to at least compensate for something through food. Jacob can prepare a potion that will restore her body to a stable state, but the process will be extremely painful, and the potion will only serve as a temporary solution to the problem, not a complete one. Henry thanked his assistant for his work and sent him out the door to start brewing the potion as soon as possible. Then Alexandra opened her eyes and said that she had heard everything, and even though she was in pain even now, she was ready to keep practicing. Henry tried to explain to her that if she continued like this, little one would inflict great pain on herself, which would torture her endlessly. But even the fact that she would be in pain after training didn't stop her, because if she was really useful, no pain would stop her. In that case, the gentleman can only hope that these are not empty words. He also gave his apprentice a bag of pollen, which could be used to numb the pain if necessary. When it was late at night, the girl could not sleep. She could not admire the bags of pollen that the gentleman gave her. It is difficult to determine what this is due to, but most likely the little girl just very but did not receive gifts, and therefore she has such a reaction. Then she realized that she couldn't waste any more time and wanted to start practicing as soon as possible. In the process, Alexandra felt the pain that Henry was talking about, but so far, even without taking the pollen, it was quite tolerable. The next day in the dining hall, the master met his student and was surprised, to say the least, since he didn't know what the girl had been trying to cultivate that night. He didn't understand why she started eating even more and even faster. When the little girl had had enough to eat, the man warned her to hold on tight, and to see that the food did not come back up. After a while they did arrive. As it turned out later, Henry had chosen this place for a reason. Deep in the mountains there is a secret place, where you can easily find the herb of ice flesh. It sounds very exciting, but the girl is still a little seasick. Suddenly Alexandra heard a rather strange sound from the bushes, and immediately notified her teacher. Not far from the guys was a real cheetah, and apparently he is not in the best mood, because the guys disturbed him. Because of this he will try to take revenge. At first he behaved more or less calmly, but then at the most unexpected moment, he attacked the guys. As strange as it may sound, but Alexandra was not frightened at all, and even on the contrary covered her teacher with her body to try to save him from the attack of such a large and aggressive animal. Then in her little child's head the question arose, how she could stop such an animal on her own. Usually they think about it at the very beginning, but apparently Alexandra had a slightly different view of the situation at that moment. Henry didn't expect to be rescued by a girl, so he did it all by himself. Thanks to his abilities, the man caught the cheetah in flight, and will hold it steady until only bones are left of it. Henry also reported that they were lucky enough to stumble upon blood amber flowers. They are also considered extremely rare, and can always come in handy. When the cheetah has turned into a skeleton, Henry deliberately waits a few more minutes, and builds back the flesh of the animal. This skill is called manuscript rebirth. Thanks to it, tonight the guys will have tiger meat for dinner. Alexandra was just in shock at this point. When all questions as to the tiger's plan were settled, Man gently took out a single flower of a rare plant. As night was about to fall, Henry asked the little girl to take the lion with her, and go with him to the cave to wait out the night there. Inside the cave, the boys had built a fire and a makeshift brazier to cook delicious meat on. Alexandra was sitting by the fire, and Henry was sitting a little farther away, looking thoughtfully into the distance, as if he were working out some cunning plan to take over the world. At one moment the gentleman abruptly jumps up, points his finger at the girl, and orders her to watch her breathing. Of course, Alexandra did not understand what had happened and how to behave, so she was initially just frightened. The problem was that Henry found some people on the street, and after looking at them from the outside, the man was able to determine that they were cult followers. But normally they shouldn't be here, so the question is, what are they doing here? But if these guys dare to interfere with his plans, the whole gang will never come back, and every effort will be made to do so, because no one has the right to interfere with the Lord. Meanwhile, Mary was in the same forest. For all her time here, this was the third time she had come across the same people. Now there was a very interesting why are there so many cultivators here? Is there some kind of secret energy source? When suddenly Mason noticed something very important, namely the traces of the battle right in the middle of some glade. Frankly speaking, just walking through this forest for Mary is getting boring. Her main goal was to find at least some rare flowers, but so far she has nothing at all succeeds. She was also madly curious to find out who was picking all the flowers here, whether it was the cultists or Henry's work. In the end, amidst a lot of anger, the girl once again gets off her seat and goes in search of an alchemical furnace to start making elixirs. In principle, Mason was not against helping her, but moving at night in this forest was too risky, not worth it. Mary didn't even listen to him, but just went about her business. The next morning Alexandra woke up to a bright ray of sunshine. The girl complained that her body felt very heavy in the morning, and suggested that it was probably because of the last training. After these words, the genius immediately checked her with his power, and concluded that the little girl's body was still struggling with heaviness and pain, and they had not found the right plant. Certainly that Alexandra is raising her personal level of chi quite quickly is good, but for now it is probably logical to strengthen the training, because at this rate in the future the little girl will only hurt herself and nothing good will come out of it, but at least for now it is time to move on. Also, before starting the long journey, Henry handed his apprentice a new vial. The contents of this bottle must be drunk during the next training session. It was the same pain reduction potion that Jacob had prepared. Just from the realization that the training was not over yet, Alexandra was insanely happy. Being somewhere deep in the forest, the girl decided to inquire about the alchemical furnace they were looking for, how valuable it was and how often it was used. It is of a higher quality than many other furnaces, and if Henry's memory serves him correctly, it should be somewhere around here. The man also warned to be very careful, because the way to the furnace was blocked by a jade snake. The most important thing was not to get under its attack, because if it did, there could be big problems, as suddenly nearby Henry heard the sounds of a heavy battle. And when he saw Mason fighting against the snake, he was shocked. Frankly speaking, he did not understand what the hero of the novel forgot in this place. But nevertheless, after a few minutes of watching this fight, I can say for sure that he has very little chance to defeat the snake. In general, to fight against this thing, the guy was supposed to be paired with Mary, but for some reason she just disappeared somewhere, and now he has to do it alone. But even so, he did not lose enthusiasm and continued to fight from the very last strength. At this point Mason gripped the sword firmly in his hands, and pointed it clearly in the direction of the snake. Deep down he believed that this blow could really be decisive. But Henry for some reason was convinced otherwise. He even began to try to prompt him. Unfortunately, it was completely useless, because the guy was 100% involved in the duel. In the end, the serpent was really not stupid enough to just jump on someone else's sword. At the very last moment, the monster dodged it, and made the strongest blow with its tail. This led to the guy using his body to break a whole bunch of trees during the flight, and at the very end he was lucky enough to land with his back right on a huge rock. And to be frank, it's already pretty hard to realize the fact that he's still alive. When the matter began to smell fried, Henry himself came to the aid of this goody-goody. For some time the snake did not even want to attack, because it realized that now it was facing a much stronger opponent than the previous one. When Mason saw that this serpent could control spiritual power, he was almost out of his mind with surprise. In general, the blow turned out to be so powerful that surely everyone who is in the forest felt a small explosive wave on himself. But no matter how it goes, such techniques of our hero cannot defeat our hero, because he easily blocks them, and in general, the man expected that it will be somehow more fun, but in the end remained disappointed. Mason, in turn, when he saw that Henry didn't even move, was shocked again, because he couldn't understand how it was possible. Then Alexandra burst onto the battlefield to try and help her master. She used her strength and sent a small stream of wind in the direction of the serpent. But unfortunately it did not help at all, but instead made the snake even more angry. In the end he even dared to answer her. First he began to throw his small sharp things, and then rushed straight at her. When the snake opened its huge mouth, it must have imagined how tasty it could eat, but as they say, when Henry saw that the little girl was in danger, he used his power to create a huge hand, completely encircled the snake, and in one moment, he made a fist. Because of Henry's incredible strength, the snake literally just split into a whole bunch of different parts. The opponent was defeated and his core was carefully removed. The Lord was now several times stronger, and thanks to the core, he had discovered many new skills. In the meantime, Alexandra was sitting on the floor. In fact, it was a miracle that she survived, because those sharp scales could have hit any part of her body, and God only knows what would have happened next. Anyway, the girl apologized for her amateurishness, and for being careless. Henry responded by saying that she didn't have to apologize, because it was thanks to her that he was able to extract the spiritual core in perfect condition, which is usually very rare. For example, if the snake had turned its attention solely to Henry, it would have felt desperate, and that would have triggered the release of snake venom into the spiritual core, which would have degraded its quality. But seeing Alexandra made the snake hopeful, and that allowed the core to be extracted in perfect condition. After the master praised his student, and healed her wounds a little, he asked her to continue to follow him. Alexandra in turn could not believe her ears, it felt so good. Mason, meanwhile, wasn't laughing at all, for he was wondering why this strong young man had come here, if he was here to get the furnace. But anyway, the boy got up the courage to go and try to find out. As soon as Mason got closer, it was the other way around. Henry was the first to ask him what he was doing here. To be honest, the guy was a little confused, and couldn't think of anything better to say than that he was just passing by and had stumbled upon a huge snake. Then Henry immediately asked where the companion Mason was exploring the woods with had disappeared to. First of all, the guy couldn't even figure out how he knew about the companion, and secondly, he didn't know where she disappeared to, as if she just run away, without even giving me a reason why. And the last question was whether the lad had met the cultivators here. He answered with certainty yes, and even pointed with his finger to where they were going, for sure. This was to divert Henry's attention so that he would go in the direction of the cultivators and use the stove, but it did not work out that way. After Henry didn't react at all, the boy was 100% sure that the gentleman was heading straight for the cave, which he didn't like as much as possible. Unlike the last cave, it was almost completely unlit, and there was a strange odor of blood in it. Looking around, Henry could tell that the horrible smell of blood was coming from the pile of bones. He was surprised by the fact that he didn't remember it in his past life, which was a little alarming, because if there was an odor, it meant that it had happened recently. The first thing he assumed was that it was the work of the sect followers, but even so, the question of what they forgot in the Emerald Dragon Mountains remains open. After all, their first or second stage cultivation level is no match for the spiritual level of the serpent. This means that it is too irrational for them to take such risks, because they will lose too many fighters, and it is not certain that they will be able to defeat the dragon. Henry noticed some strange sacks, of course out of curiosity, and wondered what was in them. But as soon as the man grasped one of them, he sensed someone else's presence nearby. But no matter how hard the gentleman looked, he could not see anyone. In situations like this, the most important thing is to keep a cool head, and at the very least, make sure the furnace is in place. After Henry checked everything, he couldn't get the sound he had just heard out of his mind. There was definitely someone at the other end of the cave. To make sure that the gentleman was mistaken, he decided to walk around the cave for a while, but he couldn't find anyone. Suddenly this time the man heard someone talking outside, so he decided to get out there at once. As it turned out, it was Mary talking. She was quietly hiding behind a rock and complaining about life. She was especially upset when she found out that it was really Henry in the cave. In fact, it's hard to put into words how much she hates Alexandra, because this girl was lucky enough to be raised by such a powerful man. Now she has the opportunity to receive all the benefits that originally belonged to the mayor's office. As soon as Henry left the cave, Mary immediately went down after him to get the furnace, but of course it could not be found, because the man had long ago taken it away and went on with his business. How strong the girl was angry at that moment, even hard to convey in words. In that case, Mary made the decision to identify the cave as soon as possible and tried to catch up with Henry. Meanwhile, outside near the cave, as I did so, the guys locked Alexandra up with bars and began to question her about what had happened here. The little girl tried to keep her mouth shut and not to say anything at all about the serpent and the furnace. Of course, none of them liked this game of silence, so the men decided to take more radical measures, namely, they began to force the girl to touch these bars, after which she received an electric shock. A little later, a member of their team came up to the chief and reported that the jade snake's aura was not sensed. But against this backdrop, another question arose: where it could have gone, because the girl's spiritual level was too low for her to be able to overcome it so easily. Eventually, the man in charge ran out of patience, grabbed the girl by the neck, and kept asking the same question endlessly: what happened to the snake? Then he even managed to compliment Alexandra. After an hour of interrogating her, he finally got a glimpse of how cute she is. Of course, compliments from strange men she does not accept, so the first thing she asked to take her hands off her, and then sent this bandit far away. Unfortunately, such a reaction to the compliment he did not like very much, and then decided to try to hit the girl's face with his fist. But as they say, Henry's here, with just one easy move, he's taken away the ability of one of the gang to fight for the rest of his life. But don't get too comfortable, this may not be the only thing you have to lose for all your sins. Frankly speaking, after such an act the other guys even got a little tense. At least they became very curious about the mysterious man who allows himself to commit such serious crimes. After Henry went to his student and freed her from the electric grid. As soon as Alexandra was free, she immediately apologized to the Lord for letting those guys catch her. Henry responded with a single-hand gesture to show that now was not the time to apologize. As Henry was not actively dialoguing with these guys, they decided not to wait long, and the whole crowd, armed to the teeth, attacked the man. At that moment, despite the fact that a whole crowd of mercenaries was flying at Henry, he felt as calm as possible, because he realized that they had no chance whatsoever. To stop these porcupines, the young master decided to use a blocking talisman. After using it, the men all froze in midair, and were no longer able to use their energy, because it was simply blocked. When the men hovering in the air had already completely calmed down, they had the honor of watching little Alexandra become a powerful adult woman. In an instant, a huge flow of energy began to emanate from her, which she would now gladly use, on her master's orders to leave the life of only one. After completing the transformation process, in her hands appeared quite a powerful magical weapon, which right now the little girl will explain to the boys how to behave towards children, and what can be in the case of not adhering to these elementary rules of etiquette. In the end, the building was done just fine. Out of the whole crowd of these mercenaries, Alexandra made the decision to let live the very one, the man who tried to hit her in the face with his fist, but then immediately paid dearly for this stupid idea. As soon as the opportunity arose, the girl grabbed the remaining bandit by the leg and dragged him straight to Henry so he could do to him what he must have planned. To be frank, the man looks as sad as can be. I don't know if he'll be able to answer the questions he's asked. Also during the battle, Alexandra had time to clean the pockets of each defeated opponent. Of course, she did not keep anything for herself, but simply handed the booty to her master. Since such a favor does not interest Henry, he allowed the apprentice to keep the booty for herself. Before starting the conversation, the man generated a small healing magic ball and sent it directly into the injured bandit, after which he almost instantly recovered and was ready for a constructive dialogue. As soon as the man regained consciousness, Henry said that he would now ask questions, and the man lying on the floor would have to answer them. In response, the victim immediately made a mistake, and instead of answering the question he asked, he started asking a whole bunch of his own. Of course, no one is going to tolerate such an undesirable attitude for long, so Henry again asked his student to remind the man what will happen to him if he doesn't stop asking his stupid questions. Of course, after that, he immediately settled down, kneeled down in front of the Lord and told him that he was a follower of a sect named George. Henry then asked what exactly his sect was doing in the Jade Dragon Mountains, and George replied that he and his team had come in search of the Yunling's secret realm. This answer shocked the master quite a bit, and he wondered how such a small sect could know about this mysterious kingdom. George said that this rumor was started by a sect called the Qing, and he didn't even know how they got this information. Well, that was basically the end of the blitz, and Henry threw George away like some kind of toy. Then the man crawled over to him on his knees and begged for mercy. But apparently not this time. The gentleman was in no mood for mercy, so he just decided to wipe George off the face of the earth. Well, at last the trouble was over, and now it was safe to leave. Meanwhile, Mason and Mary were sitting in two different trees, waiting for it to be over, and frankly they were so tired of sitting there that if it had gone on any longer the guy would have fallen right in front of them. Well, at least Mary was able to get down safely. Now she was also insanely curious to find out what this insanely mysterious place called Yunlin was all about. The girl then asked her companion to get up as soon as possible so they could follow Henry eastward and try to find out where their kingdom was. When night fell, Henry decided to make a rest, so that Alexandra could have a proper dinner, while he would deal with the stove that they had just today obtained in the cave. After the initial procedures, it will take a little while for the contents to kick in. For this small period of time, Alexandra already changed quite a lot. At least the girl has become independent, can get her own food to cook and eat. With each subsequent day it becomes more and more difficult to call her a child. She is very progressively becoming a real adult person. By the way, she was already oriented in this forest. She was able to determine that the guys are almost in place, for one simple reason, that on the way began to meet more and more cultivators. And then Alexander asked how her master was doing, because she could see with the naked eye that something was wrong. It turns out to be true, he has a few things on his mind that he hasn't been able to clear up yet. After the little girl decided to share what she had managed to gather some useful information, judging from the conversations of those guys, there are now 3 sects of disciples heading to the secret realm at once. Moreover, the chief masters of these 3 sects would personally guide their wards to the Jade Dragon Mountains. Henry was very interested in this statement, and from that moment on, he asked for more details. How can you be so sure of this? Anyway, a little while earlier the elder of the Qing sect decided to go in search of the Jade Ring, but after he came back from his search everyone started acting up abruptly. Then Henry asked the little girl to stop, and started trying to put all this information together. Heading to the slums, Henry seized an opportunity that originally belonged to Mason and set off a chain reaction that led to the elder of the Qing sect learning of Lin's secret realm. Now that it all fits together, it's not hard to figure out who started the rumors in the first place. As the gentleman suddenly felt how pleasantly smells meat, and realized for himself 100% that it is time to put a little thoughts on the back burner, and the first thing to sit down and eat properly. Of course, Alexandra supported him in this endeavor, and even gave him a piece of meat of her own. After a while, right in the middle of the meal, Henry heard his new stove make a noise. First he smoothly stopped chewing, and put the food aside, then slowly walked over to the stove, and was finally able to see how the flowers he had picked made a healing pill. It would seem that Gina is a grown man, and is happy to create a pill as a small child, but now the guys are 100% convinced that this is a real dragon alchemical furnace. Now the most important task is to find many different useful plants to make them cool pills, at least for Alexandra. As a reward for a job well done, the little one also received one pill for her personal use, which meant she could use it whenever she wanted. Alexandra was as happy as ever, and if it were Henry, anyone else would give her gifts more often. In general, for the girl to always be useful to the master, she must constantly improve, so this is certainly not the last pill he handed her. Also, before going to bed, the man reminded the little girl that she has only 8 days left, so she should spend them in a good way. She didn't understand what was going to happen after 8 days, but Henry explained to her that after that time the entrance to the secret realm of Junlin would be opened, and then they could use the key to enter it together. In response, the little girl promised to keep practicing harder and harder. With great enthusiasm, Alexandra even wanted to start training now, but almost immediately realized that if she started training she would probably wake up her master, and nothing good would come out of it. For now, the best solution would be to go back to the fire, grab a piece of meat and continue the meal. Meanwhile, in the eastern part of the Jade Dragon Mountain Range, something very serious was happening. The creators of the three sects had united, formed their troops, and were about to go through the portal to search for the mysterious place that had recently been rumored. Before entering the portal, the guys talked a little among themselves, praised each other for a satisfactory operative organization of troops, and of course wished themselves luck. The most important thing is that after teleportation did not have to wander long through the woods and look for where is this place. The next day, Alexandra woke up wide awake, and tired, to say the least. No matter what anyone says, but practicing is really hard work, which wears the body down to almost nothing, but when a person comes to perfection, he begins to really live well. While Henry was engaged in personal improvement, Alexandra decided to go to fetch water so as not to distract her master too much from the cultivation process. When the girl was already in a deep forest, she was suddenly attacked by a leopard. He was so huge and strong that it was hard to imagine how the little girl was going to beat him. But nevertheless, despite such a serious opponent, she felt as confident as possible, and even sometimes had time to play with her future lunch. But frankly speaking, playing with him pretty quickly bored, because the girl was hungry and would not mind to taste this cheetah. To do this, she applied her skill with which she held the animal in the air, and then threw it hard into the wall.